House of the Dragon had a lot riding on its success. If it didn't perform well, both in terms of critics and in viewership, it would put the future of A Song of Ice and Fire content on TV at huge risk due to the sudden and significant backlash to the handling of Game of Thrones Season 8. In some regards, looking at how hugely popular Game of Thrones was, how steep and hard it fell out of the cultural zeitgeist in only 3 short years is actually quite shocking, regardless of your feelings on Season 8 and its issues. In some ways, it's just as surprising how successful House of the Dragon was when you consider the damaged position it was starting from. The question I want to look at in this video is if House of the Dragon did indeed redeem Game of Thrones as a television franchise in the eyes of viewers, fans, and critics. Now, I have specified viewers and fans as 2 separate subjects, namely because 99% of people who watch shows such as Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, while are fans of it, don't necessarily engage with the wider fandom other than really watching the show each week. I don't like the term casual fans, but there is a distinction between your average viewer who tunes in every week and more hardcore fans. In the context of this video, fans of the show are those who tend to discuss the show online and like watching videos such as this. Both are equally as valid, but both are looking for different things from the show and enjoy differing elements of it. Thus, when it comes to discussing the idea of redeeming the franchise, both these audiences will be looking for different things. I think the best metric to use in terms of viewership would be how many people actually watch the show. Now, the most viewed episode of Game of Thrones was of course the season finale, which was reported to have got 19.3 million live viewers, which is a huge number, but not surprising at all, given that Game of Thrones, in a way, was more of a cultural event. However, it gets even crazier when you look at the reported consolidated viewership of the show that includes live viewership and all other on-demand platforms. Apparently, Season 8 averaged 46 million viewers per episode, and to make that even more impressive, that does not include worldwide viewership or the huge amount of piracy that of course happened. So let's compare that to House of the Dragon, as that may give us some insight into how the show performed in terms of this wider audience. House of the Dragon's most popular episode was Episode 2, which achieved 10.2 million viewers. While that is about half of the Game of Thrones viewership for the final episode, 10.2 is nothing to laugh at, making it one of HBO's most popular shows of 2022. Those figures would place House of the Dragon around similar viewership levels as Game of Thrones Season 2, which is not bad for the first season of a spin-off show, and indicates, while there were of course large amounts of viewers who were not happy with how Game of Thrones ended, enough came back for House of the Dragon to allow for its strong performance. The trouble with using these numbers to gauge success is how we measure viewership has changed a lot over the last 10 years. Some of these figures for the early seasons of Game of Thrones don't factor in on demand in the consolidated numbers to the extent that we do now. Plus, in House of the Dragon's case, it seems some news sites and HBO themselves reported consolidated figures that factor in worldwide viewership rather than just the US. For example, numbers from the UK from platforms such as Sky Atlantic and Now TV. Plus, there is also another data set out there. The consolidated viewership for Season 8 of Game of Thrones was 44 million per episode, and House of the Dragon is 29 million per episode. However, the issue with this data set is that in terms of the early seasons, the numbers they are counting as consolidated are not quite as consolidated as they would be if they were collected today, which makes it hard to really build a true picture in terms of these early seasons. While there is nothing wrong with that, it does make making a fair assessment a little bit more complicated. What you can take away from this, in terms of viewership, is no matter how you cut it, House of the Dragon performed much stronger than I think anyone was expecting in terms of the number of actual viewers. I suspect good word of mouth and the damage control HBO did in the lead up to the premiere did help somewhat. Assessing the critical view of the show is a little more straightforward and complex at the same time. We can look at the IMDb scores and historically for each episode and see where House of the Dragon sits in terms of critical view. When you look at the IMDb scores for Game of Thrones, you notice very similar pattern season to season, with the highest rated episode coming towards the end of the season, hitting around 9 out of 10. However, lower rated episodes never seem to fall below 8, with the season averaging out at mostly 9 out of 10. However, the consistency of these high scores does seem to drop after Season 4, with Season 8 being the first time the show hit 7 out of 10, until mid-season, where we see an episode-on-episode drop, till we have the season finale sat at 4.1 out of 10. This brings the average score of Season 8 down to a low 6, a huge drop in comparison to the other seasons. However, one thing I should point out is these scores are very unmoderated and from users of IMDb, which means that if you were so inclined, you could leave multiple low scores. If enough people do this, it will affect the rating. While I do feel there is some of that at play, in Game of Thrones' case, especially in the last season, those scores do seem to fit the general mood of the audience. Now, where does House of the Dragon sit in comparison to Game of Thrones? On IMDb, it sits around the high 8s, with some episodes pushing into the low 9s. The season average user score is about 9.3 for the season, which would put it on par with Season 4 of Game of Thrones, which had a season average of 9.3. But regardless, based on these user scores, House of the Dragon has performed similarly to the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, which in many fan circles are regarded as the best. If you want to define critical viewer reception as lesser viewer feedback, and more response of the mainstream media, we can take a look at sites like Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic scores of both shows. On Metacritic, Game of Thrones has an overall score of 86 out of 100, which is very good must-watch TV. Now, where it gets interesting is the lowest reviewed season was Season 6, with 73 out of 100, with the widely lamented Season 8 being 77, so actually quite higher than Season 6, which is quite odd. In fact, critically, according to Metacritic, Season 8, even the worst episodes, were highly praised by mainstream media sources. You can see, when you look at the comparison to user scores on the site, that there is a bit of a disconnect between the mainstream media and casual fans. By comparison, House of the Dragon sits at a 69 out of 100 for the critical score, which by their metrics means it is worse than anything Game of Thrones ever did, including all of Season 8. Which is a questionable argument to be made, while the fan score on Metacritic for House of the Dragon is mixed. That is almost expected, given it is the first season of a spin-off of a show that failed to stick its ending. Issue I have with a lot of these review aggregation sites is you tend to see a lot of people giving it either a 10 out of 10, then just as many people giving it a low score, which means it just averages out at a mixed score and doesn't really give you a fair representation. But what we can take from this is that in the view of the mainstream media, Season 8 of Game of Thrones was actually pretty good, and House of the Dragon is in fact worse than it. But I think it's been made clear over the last 10 years that the views of the mainstream media review sites don't hold their weight like they used to, with people much more interested in user reviews. What does this data actually tell us? If it's to be believed at face value, the numbers suggest that House of the Dragon, in terms of fan reviews, is performing as well as Game of Thrones at its peak. However, this view is not shared by the mainstream media, and also these figures should be taken with a huge pinch of salt in terms of their accuracy, and thus puts into question what we can really learn from it. So what about fan response? Well, this is difficult, as it's a very subjective matter. All I can really do is talk about my experience of running a Song of Ice and Fire YouTube channel since 2018, and how things have changed over time. I started making videos in the gap between Season 7 and Season 8, and much of the discussion in the comment section were people really excited for the final season. The hype was really palpable. Now, I didn't have near as many subscribers as I do now. What I can say is after Season 8 aired, the mood of the fanbase totally shifted from this love and hype for the show to lots of disdain and resentment for it. The reason I chose to focus more on lore surrounding Fire and Blood and the wider world of Westeros rather than the main book series was people were really not into the main book series content, and when I did make videos involving it, the comments followed the same trend of anger and disappointment towards how the show panned out. House of the Dragon changed all of that. For the first time in a long time, fans really seemed to be enjoying A Song of Ice and Fire content again, and the franchise as a whole. There was a lot of hope that House of the Dragon might learn from the mistakes that were made during the final seasons of Game of Thrones. And in truth, I don't really think anyone expected it to be as good as it was and be so widely loved by fans, which I think helped it in a way, because people were going in with very low expectations. I don't even think HBO really thought it would do as well as it did, and I believe they were really ready to do a lot of damage control. To put it into measurable terms for you, from a YouTube point of view, when the first episode of House of the Dragon aired, I had just passed 4,000 subscribers. By the end of the 10-week run, I was sat on 28,000, and now have 31,000. Numbers I never dreamed I would reach when I first started. House of the Dragon really did relight the flame within the fandom from that point of view. But it goes further than that. The Reddit communities were much more active. People were talking about it again on Twitter and other social media platforms. I've even seen people much more frequently talking about it in real life. While there is still a lot of bitterness towards how Game of Thrones ended, House of the Dragon has somehow managed to entice many of the fans it burned. But I do think the true measure of House of the Dragon's success is still to come. It's alright having a good first season. You have to follow it up till the credits roll on the last episode, as we sadly learnt from Game of Thrones. So when you take some time to look at the data a bit more objectively, can you in fact argue that House of the Dragon somewhat redeemed Game of Thrones? Well, yes, no, and it depends. In the sense it injected life and community back into the fandom, then yes. Did it generally perform well to a wider audience? Yes. Was the show's quality better than what Game of Thrones became? I would argue yes, albeit with some worrying moments still. Did it perform better than anyone, including HBO, expected? Yes. And it has opened the door to many more Westeros-based spin-offs that would not have happened if the show had flopped. However, it does not redeem the mistakes that were made within the last few seasons of Game of Thrones. I do think people are going to be mad about this for a long time to come. But House of the Dragon is a step in the right direction for the franchise as a whole. And finally, it really depends. There are some out there who would argue that Game of Thrones didn't need to be redeemed or fixed. There are some who are okay with the final seasons. And you know what? Each to their own, and that's okay too. What you have to remember is that if you're even watching this video, you are in what I consider the more hardcore side of the fanbase, who make up a very small part of the total number of show watchers. While we are vocal and loud about our dislike of the later seasons of the show, it very well may be much more of the wider fanbase are kind of indifferent about it at this point. I know people who are big fans. They didn't particularly care for the ending, but it didn't sully their view of the show as a whole. So what I really want to know in the comments is what you guys feel about the later seasons of the show, and does House of the Dragon make you feel hopeful for the future of the franchise? And finally, did the franchise even need to be redeemed in the first place?